Snow was already threatening the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range when Michael Caldwell spotted the impossibly thin plume of smoke. No one lived in Dead Man's Draw. No one could live there. Yet, through the scratched lens of his brass spyglass, he saw her, a woman in a tattered calico dress, hauling a bucket of water with hands bleeding from the biting wind. She was entirely alone, woefully unprepared for the brutal Wyoming winter, and clearly hiding from something terrifying. What Michael chose to do that blistering Tuesday afternoon wasn't just a simple act of charity. It would unravel a violent web of deceit, bloodshed, and a scandalous romance that the mountains had tried to bury forever. Michael Caldwell was not a man who sought out the company of others. For the better part of a decade, the towering, broad-shouldered mountain man had made his living running trap lines along the icy creeks of the Wyoming Territory. He traded his pelts twice a year at Fort Washakie, bought his coffee, flour, and gunpowder, and immediately retreated back into the unforgiving wilderness. He preferred the honest brutality of the mountains to the treacherous nature of civilized men. Missouri had taught him that lesson the hard way, leaving him with a chest full of scars and a heart deadened by betrayal. It was mid-October, the season of dying leaves and freezing dew, when Michael noticed the anomaly. He was tracking an Elk Ridge side when a faint gray smudge marred the pristine blue sky to the north. Dead Man's Draw. It was a notoriously steep, shadow-choked canyon where a failed prospector named Jebediah Rust had built a shoddy timber cabin years ago before succumbing to a rock slide. The cabin had sat rotting and empty for 5 years. Curiosity, a dangerous trait for a mountain man, got the better of him. Michael moved through the dense pines with the absolute silence of a ghost, his Winchester rifle resting easily in the crook of his arm. It took him 2 hours to navigate the treacherous descent into the draw. When he finally reached the tree line overlooking the clearing, he knelt in the damp moss and peered through his spyglass. He expected to see a gang of outlaws on the run, or perhaps a pair of foolish, greenhorn trappers. Instead, the glass focused on a woman. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with hair the color of roasted chestnuts tied back with a frayed ribbon. She was wearing a city-made wool coat that had clearly seen better days, the hem caked in frozen mud. Michael watched, entirely motionless, as she swung a heavy iron axe at a log of green pine. Her form was terrible. The axe glanced off the damp wood, nearly biting into her leather boot. She dropped the handle, buried her face in her hands, and Michael could see the violent shaking of her shoulders. She was crying. For a long time, Michael just watched. His instincts screamed at him to walk away. The mountains were a cruel judge, and they did not tolerate the weak. Whoever this woman was, she was a dead woman walking. The roof of the old cabin sagged under the weight of rotting pine needles. Her firewood was freshly cut, meaning it would smoke terribly and provide no heat. And the winter, the true bone-snapping Wyoming winter, was only weeks away. But as she wiped her face, set her jaw, and picked up the axe again, Michael felt a strange, uncomfortable tightening in his chest. It was a phantom ache of a life he had buried long ago. He retreated back up the ridge before the sun dipped below the peaks. That night, sitting by his own smokeless fire in a well-insulated cave miles away, Michael couldn't shake the image of her bruised, freezing hands. The next morning, Michael did not check his traps. Instead, he tracked a fat, 4-point mule deer. He dropped the animal with a single, clean shot through the heart. He spent the afternoon dressing the meat, wrapping the prime cuts in clean muslin he usually reserved for his own winter stores. Under the cover of a moonless night, Michael descended into Dead Man's Draw. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hoot of a horned owl. He approached the sagging porch of the cabin. Up close, he could hear the wind whistling through the gaps in the chinking. He could also hear her uneven breathing from inside, accompanied by the desperate, hacking cough of someone fighting off the damp cold. Michael set the wrapped venison on a wooden crate right beside her door. Beside it, he placed a small, watertight tin of Strike Anywhere matches and a bundle of dry, resin-heavy fatwood kindling. He didn't knock. He didn't leave a note. He simply melted back into the shadows of the forest, becoming nothing more than a phantom in the pines. Clara Abernathy woke to a cold so profound it felt like iron bands tightening around her ribs. She was wrapped in 2 thin quilts on a straw mattress that smelled of mildew and old dust. For a brief, Disorienting second. She thought she was back in her velvet-draped bedroom in Cheyenne. Then the wind rattled the loose window pane, and the harsh, terrifying reality of her situation crashed down on her. She had to get the fire going. If she didn't, she would freeze to death before noon. Clara dragged herself out of bed, her breath pluming in the freezing air of the cabin. She pulled her boots on over 2 pairs of wool socks and shoved the heavy timber door open to fetch her pathetic pile of wet wood. She stopped dead. There, sitting on the crate, was a massive bundle of white muslin. Clara looked around frantically, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The clearing was empty. The forest was still. Trembling, she reached out and peeled back the cloth. The sight of the rich, red meat made her stomach cramp with sudden, violent hunger. She hadn't eaten anything but stale hardtack and boiled pine needles for 3 days. Beside the meat lay the tin of matches and the fat wood. Clara sank to her knees on the frosted porch, clutching the bundle to her chest, and wept. This time, they were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. Over the next 3 weeks, a strange, silent relationship developed between Clara and her unseen guardian. Michael watched her from the ridge almost daily. He saw her face regain some color as she ate the venison. He saw her successfully use the fat wood to start a fire that actually warmed the cabin. But the winter was advancing rapidly. The first heavy snow fell, blanketing the draw in 2 feet of powder. Michael began leaving more substantial gifts. While Clara slept, he would come down and chop her green wood, stacking it neatly and replacing it with seasoned oak and hickory he hauled down from his own caches. One morning, Clara woke to find a massive, perfectly cured grizzly bear pelt draped over her porch railing thick enough to keep a person warm in a blizzard. Clara knew she was being watched. Strangely, she didn't feel hunted. She felt protected. Desperate to show her gratitude, she began leaving things on the crate. In return, Michael found a beautifully baked oat cake sweetened with a tiny bit of precious sugar. Another time, he found a small, intricately carved wooden meadowlark. Michael held the small wooden bird in his massive, calloused hands, his thumb tracing the delicate cuts of the knife. He placed it in his breast pocket, right over his heart. But the Wyoming mountains are fickle, and their mercy is always temporary. In late November, the sky turned a bruised, violent purple. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in a matter of hours. Michael knew what was coming: a whiteout, a blizzard so thick you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. He immediately packed his gear and headed for Dead Man's Draw. He couldn't just leave supplies this time. He had to make sure the cabin's roof wouldn't cave in on her. By the time he reached the ridge, the storm had hit. The wind was a physical force, howling like a chorus of demons, driving needles of ice sideways. Michael tied a rope around his waist, anchoring it to a sturdy pine, and began the blind descent. Down in the draw, Clara was panicking. The wind had ripped one of the heavy wooden shutters off its leather hinges. Snow was blasting directly into the cabin, threatening to put out her fire. If the fire died, she died. Wrapping the bear pelt tightly around her shoulders, Clara grabbed a hammer and a handful of rusty nails, pushing the heavy door open. The wind immediately knocked her flat onto the porch. Gasping, she crawled toward the swinging shutter. She never heard them coming over the roar of the wind. It was only when she grabbed the shutter that she looked up and saw the silhouettes in the swirling white. Wolves, a desperate, starving pack of timber wolves driven out of the high country by the storm. There were 4 of them, their yellow eyes glowing like hellfire, their lips peeled back to reveal long, yellow teeth. Clara froze, the hammer slipping from her numb fingers. The lead wolf, a massive male with a scarred snout, lunged. A sound like a cannon shot ripped through the howling wind. The lead wolf jerked mid-air, a blossom of red exploding from its shoulder, and crumpled into the snow. The other 3 wolves scattered instantly, terrified by the thunderous boom. Clara screamed as a massive figure materialized out of the whiteout. For a terrifying second, she thought it was a bear. He was covered head to toe in furs, snow-caked in a wild, dark beard. He racked the lever of a massive Sharps rifle, his eyes scanning the tree line. Satisfied the wolves were gone, he turned his intense storm-gray eyes on her. "Get inside," Michael roared over the wind. his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated in her chest. Clara was frozen, her body locked in shock and terror. Michael didn't wait. He closed the distance in 2 massive strides, scooped her up into his arms as easily as if she were a child, and carried her out of the blizzard. He kicked the heavy oak door shut behind them, throwing the iron latch. Suddenly, the roaring of the wind was muffled. The cabin was filled with the dancing orange light of the hearth fire. Clara was trembling violently, her teeth chattering so hard she thought they might shatter. Michael set her down gently on the bed. He pulled off his snow-caked fur mittens and his heavy coat, revealing a man who looked like he had been carved out of the mountain itself. He wore a heavy wool flannel and suspenders, his forearms thick and corded with muscle. He didn't speak. He went straight to the hearth, tossing 3 massive logs onto the fire, stoking it until the heat radiated aggressively through the small room. Then, he turned to her. "You're frostnipped," he said, his voice softer now, though still rough from years of disuse. "Let me see your hands." The storm hammered against the cabin walls, a relentless assault that made the old timbers groan and creak. Inside, the crackling fire cast long, dancing shadows across the rough-hewn floorboards. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, the bare pelt pulled tightly around her shivering frame. She watched warily as the giant of a man retrieved a tin cup, scooped snow from a bucket by the door, and set it near the fire to melt. "I'm Michael," he said, not looking at her as he worked. "Michael Caldwell." Clara hesitated. Her instincts, honed by weeks of sheer terror on the run, screamed at her to lie. "Mary," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Mary Higgins." Michael picked up the tin cup, now filled with lukewarm water, and walked over to her. He knelt on the floor, an imposing mountain of a man bringing himself down to her eye level. "Give me your hands, Mary Higgins." She tentatively extended her hands. They were raw, red, and swollen, the tips of her fingers dangerously pale. Michael took them in his massive, rough palms. His touch was surprisingly gentle, almost reverent. He submerged her fingers in the lukewarm water. "It will burn," he warned quietly. It did. Clara hissed in pain, trying to pull away, but his grip, though gentle, was immovable. "You have to let the blood return slowly," Michael explained, keeping his eyes on her hands. "Otherwise, the flesh dies. And out here, dead flesh means a dead woman." They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the shrieking wind and the popping sap of the fire. As her hands slowly thawed, the agonizing pins and needles faded into a dull, throbbing ache. Michael finally let go, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small tin of bear grease and beeswax. He began to carefully rub the salve into her cracked skin. As he did, his thumb brushed against a heavy silver locket dangling from a chain around her neck, exposed when the pelt slipped. Michael paused. His gray eyes locked onto the intricate engraving on the silver. C.A. He looked up, meeting her frightened, doe-like eyes. "Your name isn't Mary." Clara yanked her hands back, her breath catching in her throat. She scrambled backward on the bed, pressing her back against the log wall. "Who are you?" she demanded, panic rising in her voice. "Did he send you? Did Gideon send you?" Michael frowned, his thick brow furrowing. "I don't know any Gideon. I told you, I'm a trapper. I saw your smoke weeks ago. I'm the one who left the meat." Clara stared at him, her chest heaving. She looked at the bear grease in his hands, then at the fire he had built, then back at his face. The realization washed over her. The silent benefactor, the man who had kept her alive. The adrenaline suddenly drained from her body, leaving her utterly exhausted. The walls she had built around her sanity finally crumbled. She brought her knees to her chest and began to sob. It wasn't a delicate, ladylike cry. It was a deep, guttural weeping born of profound trauma and isolation. Michael felt that uncomfortable tightening in his chest again. He awkwardly sat on the heavy wooden chair near the hearth, giving her space, waiting for the storm inside her to pass. After several minutes, Clara wiped her face with the back of her sore hand. She took a deep, shuddering breath. My name is Clara, she said softly, staring into the flames. Clara Abernathy, Michael nodded slowly. That's a wealthy name for a woman hiding in a dead prospector's cabin. I was wealthy, Clara replied, a bitter smile touching her lips. My husband was Josiah Abernathy. We owned the Double Bar Ranch down near Cheyenne. Michael knew the name. Abernathy was a cattle baron, a man who owned half the territory south of the Platte River. I heard Josiah Abernathy was killed in a robbery 3 months ago. It wasn't a robbery. Clara's voice hardened, her eyes flashing with sudden, fierce anger. It was murder, an execution. Michael leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. Who killed him? The law. Clara spat the word like poison. Sheriff Gideon Hale. At the mention of the name, Michael went entirely rigid. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The mountain man's jaw clenched so tight the muscles leaped beneath his beard, and a terrifying, cold light entered his gray eyes. Clara didn't notice his reaction. She was lost in the nightmare of her memories. Gideon wanted Josiah's water rights. When Josiah refused to sell, Gideon orchestrated a stagecoach robbery, framed Josiah's ranch hands, and shot my husband in the back under the guise of resisting arrest. Clara's voice trembled. Then, Gideon came to me. He told me that as a grieving widow, I would need a strong man to help manage the estate. He tried to force me to marry him. When I refused, when I threatened to go to the federal marshals in Denver, he laughed. She looked up at Michael, tears streaming down her face. He told me he was the law. He said if I didn't marry him, he would frame me for Josiah's murder. He'd see me hang, and take the land anyway. So you ran, Michael said, his voice devoid of emotion, a dangerous flatline. I packed what I could carry in the dead of night. I bought a horse under a false name, rode north until the horse gave out, and then I walked. I found this place by accident. She looked around the dismal cabin. I thought I would die here. I almost wanted to. Until you. She finally looked directly at Michael and recoiled slightly. The gentle, stoic man who had rubbed salve on her hands was gone. In his place sat a man radiating a palpable, lethal aura. Michael? She whispered, suddenly afraid again. Michael stood up slowly. He walked over to his heavy canvas pack, unbuckled the straps, and pulled out a tarnished, silver star. He tossed it onto the wooden table between them. It clattered loudly against the wood. Clara looked at the star, then at Michael, confusion wrinkling her forehead. It was a deputy U.S. Marshal badge. 6 years ago, Michael said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. I was a deputy marshal out of Missouri. I was tracking a ring of cattle rustlers and murderers who slaughtered a homesteading family, a mother, a father, and 2 little girls. Michael looked away, staring into the fire as the ghosts of his past danced in the flames. I tracked the gang leader to a saloon in Dodge City, had him dead to rights, but a corrupt local deputy tipped him off. The outlaw ambushed me, put a bullet in my shoulder, and vanished into the territories. The lawman who sold me out, he covered the tracks and got a promotion out of it. Michael turned his piercing gaze back to Clara, the firelight casting half his face in deep shadow. The outlaw's name is long dead, Michael said quietly. But the deputy, who took the bribe, the man who let a child killer walk free? Michael walked to the table and picked up the tarnished star. His name was Gideon Hale. The revelation hung in the stifling air of the cabin, heavier than the snow burying the roof. Clara stared at the tarnished silver star, her mind struggling to bridge the gap between the ruthless sheriff who had destroyed her life and the ghost from this mountain man's past. Michael slowly picked up the badge. He didn't pin it to his chest. Instead, he slipped it deep into the pocket of his heavy wool shirt, right next to the carved wooden meadowlark Clara had made for him. For 6 years, I let the mountains swallow me, Michael said, his voice a gravelly whisper barely audible over the howling wind. I told myself that the affairs of corrupt men were no longer my concern. I traded the badge for a trapline because I believed justice was a fool's errand. But Gideon Hale, Michael's jaw tightened, the muscles flexing beneath his thick beard. Gideon Hale is a sickness, and a sickness doesn't stop spreading just because you look the other way. Clara pulled the heavy grizzly pelt tighter around her shoulders. He has an army of deputies, Michael. He owns the judges in Cheyenne. If he finds me, he won't just kill me. He'll parade me through town as a murderer to legitimize his theft of the double bar. Michael walked over to the hearth, taking the heavy iron poker to stoke the embers. Sparks flew upward like angry fireflies. He won't find you, Michael stated, a profound, unshakable certainty in his tone. Not here, and if he sends men who do, they won't leave this draw alive. For the next 4 days, the blizzard raged with unprecedented fury. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist, replaced by a screaming void of white. Inside, however, a fragile domestic rhythm took hold. The tiny, rotting cabin in Dead Man's Draw became a fortress, and within its walls, the widow and the mountain man began to truly see each other. Michael proved to be a man of surprising domestic capability. He showed Clara how to properly cure strips of venison over the hearth to make pemmican. He boiled pine needles to create a bitter, vitamin-rich tea that banished the lingering lethargy of her near starvation. In return, Clara, whose hands had blistered and bled trying to survive, took over mending Michael's torn gear. With a bone needle and sinew, she repaired the torn lining of his heavy coat. Her stitches small, precise, and surprisingly strong. One evening, as the wind finally began to die down to a mournful whistle, Michael placed a heavy canvas roll on the wooden table. He unrolled it to reveal a gleaming, well-oiled Colt single-action army revolver. "You survived the wilderness by the skin of your teeth, Clara," Michael said, pulling up a wooden stool beside her. "But surviving men requires a different set of tools." He spent hours teaching her the mechanics of the weapon. He showed her how to load the heavy, .45 caliber cartridges, leaving the chamber under the hammer empty for safety. He guided her hands, showing her how to grip the walnut handle not with panic, but with purpose. When her hands trembled under the heavy weight of the iron, Michael gently placed his massive, calloused hands over hers, steadying the barrel. The sheer heat of his proximity made Clara's breath catch. She looked up, her gaze meeting his storm-gray eyes. For the first time, she didn't see the terrifying, wild trapper who had shot a wolf out of midair. She saw a protector, a man whose scarred exterior hid a fiercely loyal, profoundly wounded heart. "You don't pull the trigger out of anger," Michael murmured, his face inches from hers. "You pull it because you have no other choice. You pull it to live." "I don't want to kill anyone, Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know," he replied softly, his thumb brushing a stray lock of chestnut hair behind her ear. It was the most intimate gesture she had experienced in months, lacking any of the predatory ownership she had felt from Gideon. It was pure, raw tenderness. "That's why I'm here, so you don't have to." The storm finally broke on the morning of the 5th day. The sun crested the Wind River Range, illuminating a pristine, blindingly white world. The snowdrifts were 10 feet high in places, effectively sealing them inside Dead Man's Draw. For a brief, fleeting moment, Clara felt truly safe. The world below, with its sheriffs and bounties and bloodshed, felt like a distant nightmare. But Michael knew the mountains. He knew that the snow, while a barrier, was also a canvas. And on a canvas, every step left a mark. The deep freeze held for 3 more weeks before the false spring arrived. The relentless sun began to melt the top layer of snow, turning the powder into a hard, icy crust that could support a man's weight. Cabin fever had begun to set in. Their supplies of flour and coffee were entirely depleted, and while they had enough cured meat to survive, Michael knew they needed medicinal supplies. Clara's cough had returned, a rattling, deep-chest hack that kept them both awake at night. "I have a cache at a trading post run by an old Shoshone sympathizer named Levi," Michael told her one morning, strapping on his handmade snowshoes. "It's a 2-day trek across the ridge. He doesn't ask questions, and he owes me his life from a bear encounter 3 winters back." Clara stood in the doorway, anxiety gnawing at her insides. "It's too dangerous, Michael. What if someone sees you? I look like 100 other nameless trappers out here," Michael reassured her, pulling his fur cap down low over his brow. He pressed a small pouch of extra cartridges into her hand. "Keep the door barred. Keep the fire low during the day so the smoke thins out in the canopy. If anyone but me comes down that draw, you use the Colt. He kissed her forehead, a lingering, protective press of his lips against her skin, and turned away, disappearing into the blinding white of the timberline. The journey to Levi's trading post, a dilapidated log structure nestled in a steep gorge near the Popo-Aggie River, was brutal. Michael moved relentlessly, driven by the memory of Clara's rattling cough. He arrived just as dusk was painting the sky in violent shades of orange and bruised purple. He entered the dimly lit post, the smell of cheap tobacco, raw hides, and spilled whiskey hitting him like a physical blow. Levi, a grizzled man missing his left eye, nodded silently from behind the counter, recognizing the mountain man beneath the frost-covered beard. Michael traded a stack of prime beaver pelts for a sack of flour, coffee beans, a tin of peppermint oil for Clara's lungs, and 2 boxes of Winchester ammunition. He was turning to leave when his eyes caught a flash of stark white paper nailed to the timber beam near the door. It was a freshly printed poster, the ink barely dry. Wanted, dead or alive, Clara Abernathy. $5,000 reward. Beneath the bold lettering was a remarkably accurate sketch of Clara, highlighting her high cheekbones and sad eyes. The text below claimed she was a ruthless black widow who had poisoned her husband, Josiah Abernathy, and fled with the ranch's payroll. It was signed in a bold, arrogant scrawl, Sheriff Gideon Hale. $5,000. It was an astronomical sum. It was enough money to turn every honest man in the territory into a bounty hunter and every outlaw into a bloodhound. Brought in yesterday, Levi grunted softly from the counter, noticing where Michael's gaze was fixed, by a rough-looking posse from Cheyenne. 6 men, heavily armed. Michael's blood ran cold. Where are they headed, Levi? They were asking about a woman matching that drawing. Said they found a dead horse with a double-bar brand frozen solid near the foothills of the Wind River. Levi leaned forward. His lone eye narrowed. They hired a local tracker, a half-breed named Hutch. Hutch knows these mountains, Michael. He knows about the old prospector claims. Michael didn't say another word. He scooped up his supplies, tossed a silver dollar onto the counter for Levi's silence, and sprinted out into the fading light. He pushed his body to the absolute limit, ignoring the burning in his lungs and the lactic acid searing his thighs. A 2-day trek became a 30-hour march of sheer, desperate endurance. He navigated by moonlight, his mind racing with terrifying scenarios. Gideon hadn't given up. He had weaponized the entire territory against one terrified woman, and with a tracker like Hutch leading them, the snow would not hide her. It would lead them right to her doorstep. When Michael finally reached the ridge overlooking Dead Man's Draw the next afternoon, his heart nearly stopped. Down in the valley, the snow was trampled. The pristine white crust was marred by the heavy, churning tracks of several horses. They had found the draw. Michael dropped his heavy sack of supplies behind a pine tree, keeping only his rifle and his ammunition belt. He slid down the steep embankment with terrifying speed, moving from shadow to shadow, his Winchester raised and ready. As he approached the clearing, he heard the loud, boisterous laughter of coarse men. He crept to the edge of the tree line. There, outside the cabin, were 4 men. 2 were tending to exhausted, steaming horses. Another was kicking lazily at the empty wooden crate where Michael used to leave meat. The 4th man, a tall, whip-thin tracker wearing a bowler hat and a dust-covered duster, was standing on the porch, repeatedly slamming the butt of his rifle against the heavy oak door. "Come on out, little bird," the tracker, Hutch, hollered, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Sheriff Hale wants to see you real bad. We can do this the easy way, or we can smoke you out like a badger." Inside, Clara was terrified, her back pressed flat against the wall beside the door, the heavy Colt revolver gripped in her trembling hands just as Michael had taught her. She had barred the door, but the old wood was groaning under the tracker's assault. Michael's vision narrowed to a pinpoint. The anger that had been simmering inside him for 6 long years finally boiled over, transforming from a cold resentment into a blinding, white-hot rage. They were hunting the woman he loved. Michael stepped out from the shadows of the pines, his boots crunching loudly on the icy snow. He didn't seek cover. He walked directly into the center of the clearing, a towering, terrifying force of nature holding a lever-action rifle. "You boys are trespassing," Michael's voice boomed across the draw, deeper and colder than the winter wind. The four men spun around, their hands dropping to their holsters. Hutch stopped battering the door, turning to look at the massive mountain man with an arrogant sneer. "Move along, trapper," Hutch spat, spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice into the snow. "This is official county business. We're here for the widow. Unless you want a hole in your chest, you'll turn around and walk back up that ridge." Michael slowly thumbed back the hammer of his Winchester. The metallic click-clack echoed loudly in the tense silence of the canyon. "I'm not a trapper," Michael said, his eyes locking onto Hutch with the lethal intensity of a wolf about to strike. "And you're not leaving this draw. Gunfire in the mountains does not echo like it does in the plains. It cracks flat and sharp, swallowed instantly by the dense pines." Hutch didn't even have time to clear his revolver from its leather holster. Michael's Winchester roared, a tongue of yellow flame piercing the freezing twilight. The heavy, 44-40 slug caught the tracker square in the chest, lifting his whip-thin frame off his feet and throwing him backward into the snowbank. The remaining three posse members scattered like flushed quail, drawing their weapons in blind panic. Michael levered his rifle with terrifying speed, a mechanical rhythm ingrained in his very bones. He tracked the second man, a burly hired gun diving for the cover of a massive spruce. Michael fired again. The man's leg buckled as the bullet shattered his knee, sending him screaming into the powder. But Michael was entirely exposed in the center of the clearing, and the remaining two men were seasoned killers from Cheyenne. A bullet whizzed past Michael's ear, taking off the tip of his fur cap. Another tore through the heavy canvas of his coat, grazing his ribs with the white-hot sear of a branding iron. Michael grunted, dropping to one knee to present a smaller target, his gray eyes scanning the swirling snow for the muzzle flashes. Inside the cabin, Clara was paralyzed by the deafening booms. The heavy oak door shuddered as stray lead embedded itself in the timber. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing it would all stop. But then she heard Michael grunt in pain. "You pull it because you have no other choice. You pull it to live." Michael's deep voice echoed in her mind, cutting through her terror. Clara opened her eyes. They were no longer the frightened eyes of a fleeing widow. They were the eyes of a woman who refused to lose the only decent thing left in her world. She crept to the shattered window, clutching the heavy Colt single-action army. She peeked through the splintered frame. Outside, one of Gideon's men was stealthily circling around the side of the cabin, his revolver aimed squarely at Michael's exposed back. Michael was pinned down by the other shooter and didn't see him. Clara didn't hesitate. She rested the heavy barrel of the Colt on the window ledge, thumbed back the hammer just as Michael had taught her, and pulled the trigger. The recoil was monstrous, sending a shockwave up her arm and bruising her palm. But the bullet flew true. It struck the flanking man in the shoulder, spinning him violently before he collapsed, groaning into the snow. Hearing the shot from the cabin, the final posse member broke from his cover, abandoning his comrades, and made a desperate sprint for the tree line. Michael rose with agonizing slowness, tracking the fleeing man. He exhaled a white plume of breath, steadied his aim, and fired one last time. The man pitched forward and did not move again. A profound, ringing silence fell over Dead Man's Draw, broken only by the moans of the wounded. Michael limped heavily toward the porch, his hand pressed tightly against his bleeding side. Clara threw open the door, her face pale, the smoking Colt still clutched in her hand. She rushed to him, wrapping her arms around his massive waist to keep him upright as they stumbled inside. "You're shot," Clara gasped, pulling away his heavy coat to reveal the spreading crimson stain on his wool shirt. "Through and through," Michael grimaced, collapsing into the heavy wooden chair by the hearth. "Missed the vitals. You did good, Clara. You saved my life." She grabbed clean rags and the bottle of harsh grain alcohol Michael kept for emergencies. As she bound his ribs, her hands were steady. The trembling had stopped. "We can't stay here," Michael rasped, his skin pale from the shock and blood loss. "Those were just Gideon's hounds. The master won't be far behind." He forced himself to his feet, gritting his teeth against the searing pain. He hobbled outside to where Hutch lay bleeding in the snow. The tracker was dying, his breathing a wet, bubbling rattle. "Where is he?" Michael demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Hutch coughed, a bloody smile twisting his lips. Gideon. He's a day behind us. Brought 20 men. Deputized half the scum in Cheyenne. He ain't just coming for her. He knows who you are, Caldwell. The telegraph in Washakie. He read the wire. He said he's looking forward to finishing the job he started in Dodge. Hutch's eyes rolled back, and he went still. Michael stood up, the freezing wind whipping his beard. 20 men. He was wounded, low on ammunition, and dragging a woman who had never survived a night in the high peaks. Dead Man's Draw was no longer a sanctuary. It was a coffin. Pack everything you can carry, Michael told Clara, his eyes fixed on the jagged, imposing peaks of the Wind River Range looming above them. Take all the ammunition, the pemmican, and the heavy pelts. We are taking their horses. Where are we going? Clara asked, shoving tins and wrapped meat into a canvas sack. Up, Michael replied grimly. To a place called Devil's Tooth. It's a narrow pass, at 10,000 feet. It's the only way out of this valley that horses can navigate. If Gideon wants us, he'll have to follow us through the throat of the mountain. They left the cabin as the sun dipped behind the peaks, plunging the world into a deep, freezing blue. Clara rode a sturdy roan gelding, leading Michael's horse as the mountain man slumped in the saddle, fighting a losing battle against fever and blood loss. The journey was a living hell. The wind stripped the warmth from their bodies, and the trail was a treacherous ribbon of ice bordering 1,000-foot drops. Throughout the endless night, Clara became the protector. When Michael nearly slipped from the saddle, she tied him to the horn with coarse rope. When he hallucinated, whispering apologies to the ghosts of a family in Missouri, she held his freezing hand and spoke to him in low, soothing tones, anchoring him to the land of the living. By dawn, they reached Devil's Tooth. It was a terrifying geological formation, a sheer, rocky gorge barely 10 feet wide, flanked by towering cliffs of black granite. It was a natural fortress, but it was also a dead end if they were caught inside. Michael practically fell from his horse. He crawled to the edge of the overlook, peering down the winding, snowy trail they had just ascended. Miles below, a long, dark serpentine line was snaking its way up the mountain. Gideon Hale had arrived. "Help me up," Michael wheezed, his gray eyes burning with a feverish, desperate light. "I need the black powder from my saddlebags, all of it." Clara dragged the heavy canvas bags to him. She watched, her heart in her throat, as Michael's bloody hands clumsily packed 3 massive iron mining charges, remnants of the old prospector's stash, into the deep fissures of the rock walls flanking the entrance to the pass. He ran a long fuse of waxed cord behind a large boulder 50 yards up the gorge. "Michael, you can barely stand," Clara pleaded, taking his arm. "Let's keep riding. We can make it to South Pass City. We can find the federal marshal." Michael shook his head slowly, leaning against the frozen granite. "Horses are exhausted. In the deep snow up ahead, they'll catch us in an hour." "No, Clara. We stop running here. Gideon has poisoned my past. And your future. Today, we cut out the rot." He handed her the Winchester and a box of shells. "Get behind that outcropping. When I blow the pass, it will cause a rock slide. It'll bury half his men. The rest will push through. Do not hesitate." 2 hours later, the sound of jingling spurs and heavy horse hooves echoed up the canyon walls. Clara crouched behind the icy rocks, the lever-action rifle heavy in her hands. She could hear them now, the arrogant, booming voice of Sheriff Gideon Hale commanding his men forward. Gideon rode into view. He was a handsome man, but it was a cruel, sharp kind of handsome. He wore a heavy buffalo coat and a silver star pinned to his lapel, a mockery of the law he swore to uphold. Behind him rode a dozen hardened killers, heavily armed and shivering in the mountain air. "Michael Caldwell." Gideon's voice echoed off the canyon walls, dripping with mock sympathy. "I know you're up there." Hutch's tracks led right to this bottleneck. "You've got nowhere to run, old man. Throw down the widow, and I'll make sure you hang quick instead of bleeding to death in the snow." Michael stepped out from behind his boulder, 50 yards up the pass. He looked like a wrathful spirit of the mountain, his clothes stained with blood, his face pale as death, holding a lit cigar between his teeth. "I've got a message for you from Dodge City, Gideon," Michael roared back. Michael took the cigar from his mouth and dropped it directly onto the waxed fuse at his feet. The spark hissed, racing down the cord with terrifying speed. Gideon's eyes widened in sudden realization. "Move! Pull back!" he screamed, yanking the reins of his massive black stallion. It was too late. The 3 black powder charges detonated simultaneously. The sound was not a bang, but a catastrophic, earth-shattering boom that physically punched the air from Clara's lungs. The cliff faces bordering the entrance of the pass shattered. Tons of black granite, ice, and snow cascaded downward in a deafening roar, burying the back half of Gideon's posse in a suffocating tomb of stone and powder. A thick cloud of gray rock dust and snow plumed into the air, obscuring everything. As the dust slowly settled, Clara coughed, peering through the haze. The pass was sealed, but Gideon and 3 of his most ruthless deputies had been far enough ahead to survive the collapse. They were dismounted, their horses terrified and fleeing, but the men were unhurt, their guns drawn and furious. "Kill him!" Gideon shrieked, his pristine coat covered in gray dust, his handsome face contorted in absolute rage. The 3 deputies raised their rifles, but Michael was already firing. His Colt revolver barked twice in rapid succession. One deputy took a bullet to the chest and dropped instantly. The second managed to fire a wild shot that shattered the rock next to Michael's head before Michael put a bullet through his throat. The third deputy, a massive man wielding a double-barreled shotgun, charged blindly through the smoke. Michael aimed, but the hammer of his Colt clicked on an empty chamber. Clara stood up from behind her outcropping. She didn't close her eyes this time. She sighted the Winchester, her breathing steady, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked. The shotgun-wielding deputy stumbled mid-stride, dropped his weapon, and fell face-first into the snow, dead before he hit the ground. Only Gideon remained. The corrupt sheriff stared at his dead men, then looked up the pass. He saw Clara holding the smoking rifle, and Michael, bleeding but unbowed, standing beside her. Gideon drew his custom, pearl-handled Colt, a frantic, desperate sweat breaking out on his brow despite the freezing cold. "You think this changes anything?" Gideon spat, aiming his gun at Clara. "I am the law in Wyoming. Even if you kill me, you'll swing from a rope, you murdering bitch." Michael slowly drew the tarnished Deputy U.S. Marshal star from his pocket. He held it up, the silver catching the pale winter sunlight. "You aren't the law, Gideon," Michael said, his voice carrying the absolute finality of a judge passing sentence. "You're just a thief with a badge. And your jurisdiction ends here." Gideon snarled and cocked his hammer, aiming squarely at Michael's chest. 2 shots rang out simultaneously, echoing like a single, devastating thunderclap across the peaks. Gideon Hale stood frozen for a second. His pearl-handled revolver slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the stone. He looked down at the twin blossoms of dark blood rapidly expanding across his chest, one from Michael's reloaded sidearm, the other from Clara's rifle. Gideon's knees buckled. He collapsed onto the frozen earth, his eyes staring blankly at the unforgiving Wyoming sky. The architect of their misery was finally dead. Silence reclaimed Devil's Tooth. The wind howled mournfully through the rocks, carrying away the acrid scent of black powder and copper. Michael dropped his gun and fell to his knees, his strength entirely spent. Clara dropped the Winchester and ran to him. She fell to the snow, wrapping her arms around his thick neck, pressing her face against his chest, listening to the steady, enduring beat of his heart. Michael raised a heavy, blood-stained hand, wrapping it protectively in her chestnut hair. They stayed like that for a long time. 2 broken people who had forged an unbreakable bond in the crucible of the mountains. They had survived the winter, the wolves, and the wickedness of men. 3 weeks later, as the first true thaw of spring began to melt the snows of the Wind River Range, a man and a woman rode into South Pass City. They bypassed the local sheriff and went straight to the federal magistrate's office. They carried with them Gideon Hale's saddlebags, stuffed with ledgers detailing years of bribery, extortion, and the fabricated bounties that proved Clara Abernathy's absolute innocence. Michael Caldwell didn't return to the high peaks, and Clara Abernathy didn't return to the velvet-draped rooms of Cheyenne high society. Instead, they rode south together, back to the sprawling plains of the Double Bar Ranch. They had ghosts to bury, a herd to rebuild, and a life to start, a life no longer lived in the shadows, but in the fierce, warming light of the open western sky. Today, the territorial archives in Cheyenne still hold the faded, wax-sealed federal pardons that officially cleared Clara Abernathy's name and posthumously condemned Sheriff Gideon Hale. While history books often gloss over the violent realities of the frontier, the legend of the widow and the mountain man remains deeply etched in Wyoming folklore. Their story stands as a testament to the fact that survival is rarely a solitary endeavor. It requires grit, yes, but it also requires profound trust. Michael Caldwell offered a freezing stranger his fire, and in return, she reignited his humanity. From the brutal isolation of Dead Man's Draw to the bloody climax at Devil's Tooth, their journey proves that even in the most lawless, unforgiving corners of the world, justice can still be exacted, and enduring love can be forged from the coldest of ashes.